Conservation Authority, and she works in coordination and ecosystem management with the Restoration and Infrastructure Division at TRCA. TRCA is a really important partner for the city, also very involved in our policy development, in our ravine strategy. And Karen has been involved working with a variety of different municipal partners and agencies and NGOs. And in fact, she oversees a team that is involved in restoring streams, shorelines, wetlands, grasslands, and forests, all in the TRCA's watershed. And in light of the acceleration that we've seen with respect to flooding and climate change in our region, I think we are truly blessed to have TRCA as a leader in our region. I can't imagine the habitats that we have without your work. So thank you so much for being here. And last, definitely not least, our very own Richard Ubbins, Director of Parks for the City of Toronto Parks, Forestry and Recreation Division. And Richard is a registered professional forester with over 30 years experience in the forestry sector. He is the former Director of Urban Forestry and City Forestry. And Richard is responsible for all aspects of managing Toronto's 8,200 hectare parks system. He's the guy. Very important job, and Richard is a really important partner with the City Planning Division with respect to all of the work that we're doing on parks and also the work that we're doing collaboratively on the ravine strategy. So Richard, we're thrilled to have you here. It's tough to do quick introductions for people that have such deep portfolios, but I really did just skim the surface. You'll have to look at the bios that we have online. So without further ado, I would like us to move straight into Amy's presentation. We will do the presentations in the order that you were just introduced, just so you know what's upcoming. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Oh, why don't you try it? It should be this button right there.
Oh, it does work. Okay. Thank you, Jennifer, for those great introductions. Again, my name is Amy Moy, and I'm with the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, where I teach courses in environmental remote sensing, geographic information science, and ecological modeling. Much of my work utilizes satellite imagery, multispectral satellite imagery, to provide data on Earth's surface. Now, for those of you who don't know, at any given point in time, there are thousands of satellites orbiting our planet, and a subset of these are dedicated specifically for Earth observation. So they are continually orbiting our planet, taking imagery since as far back as the 1970s. So they can provide multispectral global perspectives in a region of the spectrum outside of what the human eye can see, and provide us with a wealth of information on urbanization, deforestation, trends in changes on Earth's surface, and probably one of the most important is changes in land cover over time. So what we are seeing is trends of increased urbanization, often corresponding with decrease in water levels. We're seeing a decrease in glacial extent over time, as well as deforestation occurring globally and continually. So our current population sits at over 7.5 billion humans, with the time it takes for our population to double, decreasing each time that this event happens. Now, if we look more locally at Ontario, the projections for the GTA are that this region will experience the most significant increases in human population. Projections are sitting at 9.5 million by the year 2041, which is quite a staggering number. So where does this leave urban wildlife, the biodiversity that exists in this region with us? Now, we know that with increase in urbanization, we experience greater fragmentation of habitat, changes to ecosystem form and structure, changes to community structure of species living here. But we also know that cities can support rich biodiversity. Now, in Toronto, there are over 2,000 green spaces in the form of parks, parkettes, and woodlots. And around 4% of this qualifies as ecologically significant areas. And collectively, these areas support hundreds of species of plants and animals, many of which are species at risk or rare species. Now, we also know that movement among these green spaces is critical for population resilience and persistence, and this is something that my work focuses on. Now, if we look at this image of Toronto green spaces with the road network overlaid on top, we can sort of simplify this into a model where we consider each of these green spaces as patches or nodes of core habitat or ecological areas that provide those resources for animals. The links between them represent pathways that animals might take to access these different resources. Now, probably one of the most important pieces of this model is the intervening matrix. So this is all of the areas outside of the core patches, which largely determine how easily animals can move between these different patches that they need to access. Now, connectivity is defined as the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes animal movement among patches or ecologically significant areas. And movement is something that we as humans can really relate to. So we are known to alter our environment to facilitate the movement for ourselves. So we need to move to access our own resources or requirements. We move from our home to go to work, to go to the grocery store. We need to move to go for entertainment or for vacation, and these are our critical requirements, of which, yes, I'm going to say vacation is a critical requirement for survival of our species. But the point here is that it is no different for animals. They need to move as well to access those resources that they need. Now, particularly in urbanized environments, which are undergoing continual change, resources for animals can fluctuate and they can disappear entirely. We're dealing with overcrowding, competition that will drive species to disperse. And in the light of climate change, we're also looking at entire species ranges that can shift in response to these changes in climate. Now, my work looks specifically at a freshwater turtle species, where we try to take the perspective of these animals and look at their basic biology, how they respond to the landscape, and how this affects their persistence and their movements across disturbed regions. So bringing it back to the satellite aspect, we have all of this information. We have images over Earth across time, across local to global coverages. And it provides us with this information to look spatially at the landscape. So on the left, you see a satellite image over an altered region in southwestern Ontario. And on the right, you see the results of an ecological model which tries to predict corridors of movement for these animals. And the corridors are shown here in red. So what we see is that some areas are connected, but also some areas are not. So this is indicating that there are resources that animals likely cannot access, and animals within those patches are most likely isolated and they cannot move out of them. Now, I took this model a step further and tried to predict discrete pathways that these animals would take from one patch to another and compared this to the existing road network. And what we found is that there is no pathway in which an animal will not have to cross a road. And a road presents a major barrier to almost all species that we would find in our region. In relation to the turtles, what we see also is that it is the most important cohort of the adult reproductive female turtles that are leaving the safety of their wetlands to look for a sandy nesting habitat to propagate their species, and these are the individuals that are crossing the roads and experiencing mortality at a very high degree. Compounding this is the hatchlings upon emergence also have to leave their sandy nesting habitat, cross the road to access the safety of the wetlands. So we have these dual events where high mortality is being experienced, and we can probably infer logically that for slow-moving, ground-dwelling species such as turtles, the probability of crossing a road successfully is quite low. And this extends into many other species as well. So what can we do? So we know that barriers exist, but we also know in many cases what we can do. So this is one small example of a simple change in structural design for a roadside curb. So you can see on the left in the red circle is a small hatchling turtle that has emerged from its nest. Now, it needs to go access habitat on the other side of this road, and for this species, a simple curb is an impermeable barrier. So we need to switch our perspective to think about how the landscape looks to these different animals. Now instead, and this is an example from Mud Lake in Ottawa, if we change to a graded curb, now suddenly this animal is able to cross over and access critical resources for generations to come. And so we haven't completely removed this road, which is important for our day-to-day functioning, but we've mitigated this barrier so that it becomes more accessible to animals. So we do know that barriers exist in all sorts of different forms. There are challenges to animals living in or passing through cities such as Toronto. But we also do have a fairly large, diverse set of tools that we can use to help mitigate these barriers and these challenges. So for example, we know that eco-passages can work. We know that there's a variety of different types of eco-passages that can be built to allow animals to cross underneath roads or over them. We know the importance of bird-friendly development guidelines, which the city has advocated for, knowing that Toronto is situated in a major migratory flyway for songbirds. So if we want thousands of birds yearly to be able to access their nesting grounds in the boreal forest, then we need to consider the impact of our high-rises on these species. We're also beginning to see the importance of supporting our bee populations and our invertebrate populations, and as well the significance of landowners in providing habitat in their own backyards. So these can be seen almost as discrete patches of habitat or stepping stones along the way that facilitate movement of animals across the landscape. And there are also many success stories. So there are some species as well that have used cities to boost their populations. For example, the peregrine falcon, which uses high-rise buildings to emulate the natural cliffs that they would nest on in the wild. So here we have a species that was previously endangered, finding great success in the city by nesting on our high-rises and basically being provided a year-round food source of fat, lazy Toronto pigeons. So there's a lot of good success stories here, and I think a major question is, can we come together, all of us as stakeholders, because biodiversity does affect all of us, and can we do a little bit more? Can we make our city a little more hospitable to the animals that are here, and can we create green spaces that are truly functioning? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. I'm still absorbing everything that you just said and trying to get over that picture of the turtle on the fence.
Turtles can climb fences, it's true.
That's, determination. Okay, thank you very much, Amy. Scott, you are up next.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Wonderful. Thanks again for inviting me here. This is wonderful. And actually, it was really interesting hearing a lot of what Amy said, because a lot of what she said we can appreciate among our invertebrate populations as well. And so we're hearing a lot about fragmentation and connectivity and how species move about the city. And certainly cities can be barriers to a lot of larger organisms, such as large mammals, some birds, certainly these turtles and some of the reptiles we saw on the slides. But we're learning more and more about how cities can actually be hotspots for some kinds of species, certainly some species of plants, and a lot of the organisms I study which mainly revolve around wild bees. So I'll talk a bit about them. And I'm going to introduce my work in a slightly different way. I'm going to talk about biodiversity in two ways. And so I'm in the biological science department, but I also work quite closely with the Faculty of Landscape Architecture, architects, engineers, to try to understand and better integrate biodiversity and urban ecology into the way we think about city planning and design. And so, as I said, I'll talk first about biodiversity in design, but then I'll talk about design for biodiversity, and I'll try to illustrate using some examples from research we're doing in our lab, how we're trying to link these two processes together. In a city, which is, of course, very encouraging of biodiversity at the moment, we have a very strong bottom-up approach to biodiversity enhancement in gardens, in parks, community groups, lots of organized events and activities that citizens are partaking. At the same time, we have a city that's very supportive of biodiversity. We have a number of guidelines and policies that are enriching and fostering nature in our ravines, on our green roofs, and so forth. And so what I'm really excited about as a member at a university is how us at universities might be able to better link these two approaches, this bottom-up, this top-down approach to biodiversity in our cities, and find synergisms in how these two can connect, meet somewhere in the middle. Okay, anyway, so we'll talk about bees too. This thing is a little bit of a struggle. Okay, so just very quickly first, of course, biodiversity can have a very strong impact in design, not only in terms of the way in which we feel immersed or appreciate designs such as green infrastructure, bioswales, retention ponds, green walls and green roofs, community gardens, our front yards. All of these are different forms of green infrastructure which can benefit tremendously from biodiversity in those contexts. Increasingly, we've been thinking about city building and infrastructure more generally as conservators, so ways in which we can find adaptive strategies to reduce energy consumption, capture water more completely on our buildings and so on. But what I'm getting increasingly excited about in our city is thinking about how buildings can actually be contributors. And so how can buildings, of course, net zero energy and so on, but how can we even start to perhaps envision buildings as landscape, right? So the city as landscape. And when we start to think about buildings as contributors to urban ecology and biodiversity, we might be able to find some really nice stories and examples in how we can integrate this into urban planning and design. Amy illustrated a nice example with the peregrine falcons. Of course, many bee species love brick walls and all kinds of construction material to nest in. Oh no. A little finicky. And so as an urban ecologist, someone who's interested in architecture and planning and how these fields can inform biodiversity and how biodiversity can inform these fields, I'm increasingly excited about how these large themes in ecological theory and concepts can be integrated into the way in which we design the future cities. Because as we're all here today, we can acknowledge that cities face a host of very complex problems that truly require a multidisciplinary framework to address. And I argue as an ecologist that we play a very significant role at the front of that table as well, alongside, again, planners, engineers, architects, city officials, and so on. One place where we've been quite successful in trying to link biodiversity to city planning and design has been some work we've been doing at the GRIT Lab. This is the Green Roof Innovation Testing Lab at the University of Toronto and the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. And here we have what we consider one of the most instrumented green roof testing facilities in the world. And in fact, the goal of this research facility is to better understand how green roofs perform in our climate. Now, green roofs are essentially substrate and plants over top conventional roofing membranes, and they've been used for decades and even over a century in some European countries in the traditional sense. Now, of course, the City of Toronto has had some really positive actions on green roofs, and we actually have enacted the first bylaw in North America mandating their construction on a number of different building types. And so we're increasingly seeing green roofs proliferate our city, and I ask the question, how might biodiversity improve the functioning of our green infrastructure? The longevity, the improvement of water capture and cooling, its biodiversity contribution. How can we start to envision different ecosystem functions in our planning and design, prioritize which ones are important, but try to understand how design can have an impact on increasing the multifunctionality of these structures, stacking functions, right? And just quickly too, I don't have time to get into it, but when I talk about biodiversity, I'm not just talking about combining different plant species. This is not just counting species and their numbers. What we're learning about biodiversity is even in design, we can be quite prescriptive in species diversity, functional diversity, so different traits that different species have, combining those and understanding how diversity is related to functional traits, but also increasingly we're learning more about phylogenetic diversity and how the relatedness among community members can have a real significant impact on the ecosystem functioning, stability, and resiliency of these systems. And so just quickly, some of the work we've been doing in Canada has been the first empirical evidence that links this idea of biodiversity and ecosystem functioning in an urban context. So this work has been ongoing for a number of decades in meadowlands, linking community structure of meadowland plants to productivity and nitrogen cycling and so on. But we've actually been able to link, by combining grasses, by combining perennial flowers and succulents, we can actually see an increase in the multifunctionality of our green infrastructure. So biodiversity can play a role not only in how we appreciate and enjoy green infrastructure, the aesthetics of it, but also the economic angle too. So the bottom line can be affected by biodiversity. And of course, when we're up there on these green roofs and green infrastructure, even in the core of our city, we experience lots of creatures visiting these structures. And when we start to think about how biodiversity might improve our social, environmental, economic benefits that we prescribe to green infrastructure, well, how might we be able to link this other benefit, and that is biodiversity in design, but also to enhance and create habitat for more wildlife in our cities? Now, Amy touched on this a little bit, acknowledging the fact that cities are growing. They're one of the fastest growing habitats around the world. And we actually know that to save more species, we need more area. This is called the species-area relationship. And if cities are the fastest growing habitat type in all terrestrial environments, then we need to be thinking about cities in this equation. So how can cities contribute to wildlife conservation? And increasingly, we're learning with some groups of organisms, bees are the one that I'm most interested in, cities can actually be a hot spot for bee diversity. So like some birds and some plants that seem to do well or better in and around where people work, live, and play, there's many examples of bees fitting that bill. And we actually just finished this book. This is the Bees of Toronto, part of the City of Toronto Biodiversity series that the Urban Planning Division participates in publishing. And what we've learned by contributing to this book is that we have over 360 species of bee in Toronto and the Greater Toronto area. That's a lot of bees. In fact, we have about 850 odd species across Canada, and that puts our region here in Southern Ontario as one of the most bee diverse regions in all of Canada. Now, this is a really awesome opportunity for those of us engaged in urban planning and design. We have this really essential creature, pollinators, bees being the most important terrestrial pollinators around the world. We know more about our bees here in the City of Toronto than I argue any other city in the world. We have a real opportunity to put our best foot forward in thinking about, again, how the City of Toronto as a global city can play a significant role in how cities across the world plan for pollinators. And we have this really nice Toronto Pollinator Protection Plan strategy that I suggest some of you take a look at this booklet on the break. Sorry, a little bit of a plug. Of course, bees are very curious. They're charismatic mini-fauna. They can serve as flagship species. So sometimes many small changes we make to how we plan cities, how we manage parks and gardens and so on, can have a significant impact on lots of different species. And when we plan for bees, we actually benefit many other creatures such as birds, butterflies, and other insects that benefit from more flowers, more floral area. And so here's just an example of some bees. Of course, we're learning a lot about bees in cities as we start to disentangle the drivers that impact their populations. And so here in Toronto, we're very interested in how Toronto actually becomes the first location where many new bee species in Canada are identified. And that's because of the urban heat island effect. We're hotter in the City of Toronto than outside the city. We're also located in one of the most southern areas in all of Canada. And so as climate change forces species to move northward to extend their range, we're finding new species arrive in Toronto first. And so by monitoring and understanding biodiversity in our city, we can have a better understanding of how pollinators and bees are moving about even through Canada. And so just to kind of wrap this up, again, I'm very interested in linking these two ways in which we can consider biodiversity in our city. Biodiversity to support and enhance design for better ecosystem functioning, but also design for biodiversity, acknowledging the fact that we need cities to be exemplary of a win-win situation, a win for people and a win for wildlife. And so in our lab, we're very interested, again, in pollination, that service, that very essential service that we all depend on for food security and the proliferation of our native plants in our wonderful ravines, and the biodiversity of bees that support those systems. We're increasingly learning that wild bees matter. It's not just honeybees that are experiencing declines. And when we lose a honeybee colony, we can go on the internet and buy more. But when we lose our wild bee species, we may be undermining our native plant pollinator interactions that we depend on. And so we do graphs like this in our lab where you can imagine to the left are bees and to the right are flowers. And you can imagine that different bee species might visit the same kinds of flowers across a landscape. Now, through climate change or some acute disturbance that we may experience in the city, this network may be undermined where we may lose a quarter or a fifth of the bee species present in our landscape. But by understanding the network that stability it creates stability, we can ensure that these pollination systems remain unaffected. Sorry. And so just to end, we're looking at two major projects in our lab. The first is trying to understand the local and landscape factors that impact bee diversity and pollination services in our city. Again, we know more about our bees in Toronto than most any other city in the world, and so we're really poised to truly understand, again, how urbanization impacts pollinators, both for winners and losers. Again, some bees don't do so well, others do tremendously well. And so we participate with citizen science projects using these bee hotels to survey cavity nesting bees in backyards, parks, community gardens, and green roofs.
Where should Scott be pointing at?
Okay,
Right
okay, yeah, almost done, sorry. And so much like Amy works with some geographic information systems, we're very interested in landscape factors at a very local scale. Bees are operating at very small scales in backyards and parks, so being able to disentangle buildings from roads, parks and gardens from forests and urban meadows is really critical for understanding what impacts bees. We're also very fortunate in the City of Toronto to have access to the Open Toronto database, and this provides regular citizens with access to over 1,000 databases that provide everything from income levels per neighborhood, cultural identity, population densities, and education. All of these socioeconomic factors that may not be so implicated in bee diversity in a forest, in a rural or a natural area, but in cities, we must understand that environmental factors, but also socioeconomic factors will play a role in cultivating and sustaining biodiversity. And so just to end, we're very interested in understanding these shopping lists, these grocery lists that bees have and other species in cities more generally. Bees need more than just flowers. There's lots of nesting requirements that bees depend on, and if these are missing or lacking in certain neighborhoods, then those bees won't be there either. And so understanding the full gamut of what species need in our cities and considering bees as flagship species to help biodiversity more broadly is really critical. And so just one last plug too is our first project is looking at Toronto redbud trees. There's over 1,263 redbud trees managed by the City of Toronto as of the Open Data website, and many people use these in their backyards and front yards as well. What's really interesting about this tree, and I'm sure you've all seen it around, is Toronto is actually above its northern limit. Its native range is about Point Pelee. But of course the City of Toronto is a lot hotter than outside the city, and so we've kind of artificially extended the range of this really beautiful tree that provides lots of habitat for bees and birds and so on. So as global warming occurs and species ranges extend, we hear a lot about invasive species and some of the negative aspects, but this is one tree that we may see to become more common that actually provides biodiversity for many creatures. And so if you know about where these trees are in your city, or if you have one of these trees in your yard, we're really looking for people to participate in a citizen science project where we're looking at the phenology of these trees. Because what we're predicting is that across the City of Toronto, with all the different microclimatic factors that are created by brick walls and parks and so on, pavement, this creates a tremendous temperature gradient across cities. And we anticipate that this will extend flowering time of many plant species, creating this hidden driver of urban bee diversity. I think that's all I have, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we're moving the clicker across the room. Our next presentation is from Dave Ireland. Dave, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Shall I click or will you load? There we are. Yeah, so 8 years ago, the mayor of the city then, David Miller, and the Toronto Zoo staff, led by me, planted an eastern redbud in the core woods of the Toronto Zoo as a 2-year-old tree. So you should go check that out. It should be beautiful. I'm gonna take 9 minutes, hopefully 10 minutes until 3 very distinct but interconnected stories. One about salamanders, one about marketing, science, and one about whale poo. So I grew up in Huntsville on the gateway to Algonquin Park. I grew up looking for these guys all the time. This is a big, relatively robust, sometimes 6 to 7 inch long salamander called a yellow spotted salamander. These guys spend literally 10, 11 months of the year underground. They come out for 3-4 weeks and explosively breed, and oftentimes are crossing all kinds of rural and urban infrastructure to do so. We've got these guys in Toronto as well. My wife and I moved to Toronto for, career glory. Algonquin Park was going to be our home forever, but decided that south of Highway 7 needed to be done at some point. So we came south, and I worked as the senior curator of conservation at the Toronto Zoo. And within my first year, I saw this salamander, and salamanders really were my gateway drug to academia. I did graduate work with frogs and toads, and it really allowed me the platform to tell these sorts of stories. So when I got to the Toronto Zoo, certainly I had a focus on amphibians, and I saw this eastern newt. It's a beautiful animal, again, right here in the city of Toronto. But when I saw them, there was dozens and dozens of them dead on the road, just outside Rouge Park. So we launched a program, and I'm not going to get into too much detail about it because both Amy and Scott have done considerable amount of talking around connectivity and these issues. But in 2007, I founded and chaired a group called the Ontario Road Ecology Group, which provided a lot of the framework for Amy's modeling exercises and a lot. I think most of the panelists are either on our network or a part of the group somehow. At the end of the day, the Ontario Road Ecology Group is the most robust group of road ecologists in the world. It's right here, founded in Toronto. The ROM and the Toronto Zoo still partner to bring this on. And our objective primarily is to lend support, expertise, resources, and advice to planners, to city planners, to provincial planners. And we have had a great deal of success over the last 8 years, raising well over $1 million and implementing many, many different road ecology projects to help cities and other infrastructure. We had a 5-year plan when it came to Toronto, but certainly the Royal Ontario Museum job came up, and I took that. And my role generally at the ROM is to understand and to conserve nature. And a big part of that is marketing science. And so at the ROM, I interact daily with guys like Doug Curry. Now, Doug Curry is the world-leading authority on black flies. He studies black flies, day in, day out, fossil black flies, living black flies. Now, how many of you in this room particularly enjoy black flies? So this is a difficult task for a guy like me who's challenged to market his work. How do you market a guy like Doug Curry? Well, we influenced them. Well, we were very impressionable on them in 2011, 2012, encouraged all our scientists to get on Twitter. This was one great avenue to spread their work. They've succeeded at it. This slide's probably 2 years old. His following's well over 1,200 now, which is great for a scientist who's studying black flies. And the picture itself is Doug at 9:30 p.m., 10 p.m., standing next to a Friday Night Live participant who's come to the museum as a millennial to drink beer, hang out, and we put Doug on the floor in that situation with a big vial of blood and some black flies and a microscope, and all of a sudden he has a conduit to his research. In new and innovative ways. And Doug is just the tip of the iceberg. I represent about 35 scientists at the Royal Ontario Museum. All of them have very unique, somewhat esoteric sort of portfolios, but they're all amazing people. At the end of the day, they're people with great stories to tell, and so we do a variety of initiatives to raise awareness for their work. One such initiative is in 2012, we launched the Environmental Visual Communication Graduate Program. This program basically came to be because when I started it, my boss said, okay, tell the stories of 35 scientists, go. I said, well, where is the production department here at the museum? And he said, oh, do you mean Zach? And I said, whoa, so where is the capacity to tell these stories? So we very quickly partnered with a local college. We bring on students every year. We teach them videography, photography, social media campaigning. I teach the oral and written presentations. These students intensively learn at the ROM for 9 months and come away with marketable skills in science communication. And these people do internships all over the world, really, from Haida Gwaii to Switzerland to Costa Rica, to the city of Toronto. So if you're looking for an intern at 6 weeks sort of duration, these students are very good at what they do. We bring on the best faculty, I think, anywhere to provide them with the skills they need to do the work of communicating your amazing work. And Kelly and I have talked long about this, and I think the time is ripe to have one here at the city of Toronto. This is just an example. And it's a quick example because it ties in the road ecology story that Scott and Amy were telling, and I as well. One of the students showed me in 2013 that, for a long time, Ontario Road Ecology Group was showing pictures of dead turtles and dead bugs and dead snakes as a sort of a motivational factor to get people to care about roads and road ecology. Well, actually, that's probably not the best way to do it. This student showed us that animals alive on the road, showing their eyeballs to us, but associated with the road, was a far better marketing technique. And indeed, we tested it before and after we implemented this technique, and our membership went up like 500% after we were showing these more positive, less doom and gloomy pictures. Another story very quickly from this concept of marketing science at the ROM. We have great scientists at the ROM and they do great work, but how can we show the public what they do in a real sort of accessible way where the public feels like they're actually participating in it? So I can go on and on about our Ontario BioBlitz program, but the long story short is that it is an intensive 24-hour survey of all biological diversity in some given area. And believe it or not, we launched this in 2012. And again, the City of Toronto is a world-leading jurisdiction for BioBlitzes. We spoke at the IUCN meetings in Hawaii. We spoke at the Parks meetings in Australia, all lauding the Ontario BioBlitz program and quote-unquote Ravine City. It's pretty simple from the outside looking in, but if you're on a steering committee for a BioBlitz, it's pretty complicated. Anyway, the way we do it is we have scientists and we leave them alone. They do an intensive survey. Then we have the guided Blitz program where we pluck out experts and make them pair up with the public over 3 or 4 hours and do it together. And then there's a festival component. But everyone's involved, and from the outside looking in, it's a seamless program. And 2 quick stories about our success. You're right, Scott. Lichen diversity here in Toronto. Troy McMullen, the best lichen biologist in Canada, has surveyed almost every watershed in the Toronto region, and we have an incredible diversity of lichen species in our city. In fact, what we've seen through some published research is that we have more lichen diversity in the city of Toronto than there is in Peterborough. And one hypothesis is that, unfortunately, Peterborough is receiving a lot of our bad air as they're east and downwind of us, and lichens are a hairbringer for air quality. Tom and Jerry, incredible guys. These 2 people have been with our team since the beginning. They wrote the book Spiders of Toronto with Kelly and others. And this has been a real eye-opener for both our scientists and our public, because spiders and snakes seem to be another little bit of a gateway into the world of biodiversity. Some people are incredibly scared of them. Some people are incredibly embracing of them. Either way, it generates conversation. So when we found black widow spiders and we found the first tarantula species that's native to Ontario, right in the Rouge Park, people were pretty thrilled. It was great. Very quickly, because of the success of the Ontario BioBlitz program, we wrote a grant last year to the Heritage Canada Ministry under Minister Joly, and we won $1 million to launch BioBlitz Canada. So clearly this program is working, clearly this program is scalable, and I think, again, it all started here in Toronto in our watersheds, and you'll see a lot more BioBlitzes happening around the world in the coming months. So my last story, it's a quick one. Can whale poo save the world, the planet? And I would argue, yes. So how many of you have seen our whale exhibit down at the ROM? And how many of you remembered the whale poo story? Anyway, I'm not going to get into the exhibit itself. It's a wonderful story about some whales that tragically died off the coast of Newfoundland. We recovered 2 of them, put 1 of them on display. It's a very robust, major exhibition, lots of stories going on in there. But I was in charge of the sort of conservation section of the curatorial stream of it. And we told a bunch of different stories through that stream, but one such story was about whale poo. And I had no idea the significance of whale poo to the mitigation of climate change and actually the balance of our planet. So if you follow me for a second, I'll try and just tell the story in about 45 seconds. Whale poo contains an enormous amount of nutrients. When compared to ambient seawater, there are some 250,000 to 10 million more nutrients in water where whale poo is. The streams are huge. A blue whale poo stream can be 60 meters long by 20 meters wide. They poo a lot. When a blue whale is feeding, it's eating maybe 70 gulps a day. That's like 4 million krill a gulp. And they're pooing as frequently as you might expect when you're eating that much, many, many times a day. Now, what do whales eat? Primarily, let's take the blue whale, for example. The blue whale eats krill. Krill eat phytoplankton. And what do phytoplankton need to survive? Phytoplankton need 2 things. They need the sun, because they photosynthesize. And believe it or not, of all of the terrestrial biomass, all the plants and trees and everything on Earth, on our land mass, they don't provide as much oxygen and sequester as much carbon dioxide as the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are the lungs of the Earth, even though we forget that sometimes. So phytoplankton need 2 things. They need sunlight, and they need nutrients. In ambient seawater, without current upflow, it's a struggle for phytoplankton to bloom and to proliferate. In whale poo plumes, say that 3 times, they're incredibly prolific. So now let's consider this. Whales eat krill, krill eat phytoplankton. Phytoplankton need the poo and the sun. The more phytoplankton there is, the more krill there is, the more krill there is, the more whales there are, the more whales there are, the more poo there is. Very simple, short. We tell this story in the exhibition, and the idea is, and this is the only doom and gloom bit of my presentation, is in 1800, there were 400,000 blue whales. We killed 99% of them, literally. We killed most of the gray whales, most of the right whales, most of the bowhead whales. There was a whaling industry between 1850 and 1950 that saw the slaughter of millions and millions of whales. All of those whales would have been pooing and contributing to this climate mitigating tight circle. Can you imagine our world if we would restore the great whales, or at least recognize that our ecosystem services are actually contributing to our own success? So there's your 3 stories, 3 very, very quick recommendations. Simply with the road ecology one, we've got to make our urban infrastructure far more permeable to biodiversity, both insects and vertebrates. Marketing science is key. The City of Toronto has some amazing people on staff. They have some amazing scientists on staff under Richard and others. We need to make those people superstars. We need to make them accessible. We need to make them cool. And finally, this whale poo story wasn't really about whale poo. It was about the fact that our systems are far more important than the Redside Dace in the north of the Rouge Park, or a single bee, or this or that. It's about how all of this stuff interconnects, feeds off of each other to contribute to a stable system. So I'm looking forward to chatting more about it.
Great. Thank you very much, Dave. I have to tell you, I never imagined in my lifetime that planners would sort of become cool, and we're sort of becoming cool. So I think ecologists are the next wave of coolness. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Faisal. Do you have the clicker there? You're all set to go? Excellent.
Thank you very much. So we've heard a lot about non-human biodiversity. One thing we have to remember is that humans, we are also an element of biodiversity. And so we often think as scientists about what are the critical needs of, say, or for songbirds.
I want to argue that we also need to think very carefully about what are the critical needs for humans in terms of ourselves as being a key element of biodiversity in our city. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about how biodiversity is so important to sustaining the health and well-being of local residents in a city like Toronto. Now, there was a study that was published several years ago in a journal called Science, and what the journal found was that there are very few places on this planet that have never been touched by humans. From Arctic tundra to primeval rainforest to arid desert, our natural world has been fragmented by ever-expanding towns and cities, crisscrossed with roads, transmission lines, and pipelines, and pockmarked by pump jacks, flare stacks, and other infrastructure used to drill, frack, and strip mine fossil fuels from the ground. The need to supply food, fiber, shelter, and fresh water to the more than 7.5 billion of us that now live on the planet is driving the wholesale conversion of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and other ecosystems. Indeed, satellite images taken from hundreds of kilometers above the planet reveal a world that we have changed irrevocably in only a few decades. The significance of human land use was brought into sharp relief recently in a series of maps that were developed by a scientist by the name of Timothy Golden, a researcher at the University of Maryland Center for Security and International Studies. Now, using data from the U.S. Defense Meteorological Program at NOAA, Golden identified contiguous lighted areas worldwide. This is what North America looks like at night. The bright spots you see on this map reflect sources of light emissions. At night, lit homes, powered factories, illuminated city streets, and largely urban infrastructure, which now has come to dominate the planet. Golden's maps reveal how much of our planet is now under the direct influence of the human footprint, primarily due to urbanization. Now, while some cities are clearly booming, Toronto is definitely one, public investment in urban infrastructure like sewage and solid waste management, energy production and distribution, transit, and other types of technologies have largely come to dominate the discussion in rooms like this amongst our policymakers. Now, we know that governments have responded to what's referred to as the infrastructure crisis during times, so the infrastructure deficit during times of crisis, spending billions of dollars as part of economic stimulus programs, for example, to keep the construction industry growing. That was one of the policies in 2008 in the last recession. Or when alarming episodes of crumbling expressways and sewage floods make the newspaper headlines. But at the same time, a less obvious but incredibly valuable infrastructure asset of our cities, natural capital, or green living infrastructure like urban ravines and other woodlands, healthy waterways, beaches, as well as engineered ecosystems like green roofs and bioswales within the built environment have received far less political attention from government and far less government funding, at least here in Canada, despite their critical importance as critical habitat for us as humans in terms of our biodiversity needs in the city. Now, this is despite the fact that natural ecosystems and vegetative technologies like green roofs and engineered wetlands extend the life of many traditional types of infrastructure by assisting, for example, with storm management. They also provide a range of additional co-benefits, so-called ecosystem services, which improve the health and well-being of our urban communities. And we know that these ecosystem services are worth literally billions of dollars as a natural subsidy to our city. So just consider, the millions of trees in and around our city neighborhoods here in Toronto produce oxygen and improve urban air quality by absorbing pollution and airborne particles that threaten the respiratory health of the most vulnerable members of our communities, our children and our elders. Urban forests and other green space also sequester and store atmospheric carbon, thereby acting as a significant hedge against runaway climate change. For example, there was a really interesting study that was done here by the City of Toronto with the University of Vermont and the USDA Forest Service, and it estimated that Toronto's trees store an astounding 1.1 million tons of carbon annually, which is the equivalent of taking 733,000 vehicles off our roads. Furthermore, as we've heard today at the Roundtable, urban green space, particularly large contiguous patches like ravines, provide critical habitat for non-human biodiversity that we share the city with, like songbirds and insect pollinators. And it's also been associated with improved workplace productivity and even psychological and restorative benefits for urban dwellers, like stress relief. Yet while leafy neighborhoods in older parts of our city, like the Annex or my home community in the Beaches, are largely covered in urban forest, most of our large urban areas in Canada are effectively deforested. According to Environment Canada, a minimum of 30% forest cover is required to maintain a healthy local ecosystem in terms of the provision of critical ecosystem services like flood mitigation. Now, Toronto is the most forested city in the country. We have an estimated 26.6 to 28% tree canopy cover, representing 10.2 million trees. Though there are neighborhoods in our city, such as the Northwest and the Northeast, representing industrial areas and lower income communities that have far less tree canopy cover. The consequences of this decline and degradation of urban green space is far-reaching. It includes the loss of biodiversity. I don't know if this has ever been done for the City of Toronto, but I helped the City of Vancouver, for example, estimate the number of provincially and federally listed species at risk that are within the Greater Vancouver area. And we estimated that there were 100 species that are actually regulated as species at risk within the city borders. I don't know if that's ever been done for Toronto, but clearly our cities are actually a hotspot of biodiversity at risk. We also know that the decline of biodiversity is associated with higher built infrastructure costs, associated, for example, with managing stormwater, and increased vulnerability of our communities to extreme floods and other types of natural disasters. The degradation of urban green space may also be putting the health and well-being of our local residents at risk. And I'm just going to pivot now and talk to you a little bit about some interesting science that my colleagues and I at the University of Toronto and the University of Chicago are doing about the critical importance of biodiversity, particularly trees and other types of green space, to sustaining the physical health and mental well-being of local residents in Toronto. So there's a growing volume of research that has revealed the strong relationship between urban green space and public health. For example, a U.S. Forest Service study has found that widespread infestation of urban forests and tree-lined streets by the emerald ash borer, an invasive insect which is also very prevalent in Toronto, has not only killed tens of millions of urban trees, but is contributing to higher rates of death from cardiovascular and lower respiratory illness, which in fact are the second and third most common causes of death in the U.S. Now, the direct causal relationship between trees and human health is not fully understood, but scientists believe that people living in urban areas are less active, suffer from greater stress levels, and are exposed to poor air quality in neighborhoods that lack a well-developed forest canopy. Conversely, trees are so efficient at removing airborne pollutants like carbon monoxide, lead, and nitrogen dioxide that university researchers at Columbia University have estimated that for every 300 trees that are added to a square kilometer of a city, asthma rates in young people drop by an astounding 25%. Now, the benefits of nature, particularly in urban areas, is something that I would say all of us intuitively understand. For example, in the city of Vancouver, which I work a lot with, 9 million people used the city's parks and protected areas last year. That's a very strong indicator of the public's reliance and love of urban green space. Public surveys in other cities, I'm sure as Toronto, has found the same. The use of urban green space is booming, and we all benefit for it. Having access to the natural world within urban areas in the form of naturalized neighborhoods, such as city parks, treed school grounds, and green corridors, can be both physiologically and psychologically restorative by promoting mental health, reducing blood pressure and stress levels, and promoting physical activity of urban residents. Moreover, experimental research has demonstrated that interacting with natural environments, even briefly in terms of biodiversity, has measurable positive impacts on the mental well-being of local residents. Now, people gravitate to parks. Usually, if you ask people, why are you going to a park? They'll say that parks are beautiful, they're peaceful, they're relaxing, Sometimes people will even call these experiences with urban nature spiritual, uplifting. For others, it's a feeling that's difficult to describe in words, but just being in nature as part of our busy day makes us feel better. And although many people may not realize it, there's actually biological value in having those experiences with urban green space, and this value is measurable and quantifiable. It's long been established that general health, mental fatigue, and physical injury rates all recover faster when patients have access to urban green space. Studies have shown, for example, that surgery patients recover more quickly if they have views of natural landscapes outside their windows rather than views of bricks and concrete. And I'll just end with a really quick paper that we've just published in a journal called Nature about the City of Toronto that really looks at this incredible asset, our urban green space, in terms of promoting public health. So these two sort of domains, the importance of public health to the City of Toronto and the importance of green space in terms of sustaining it. So my colleagues and I at the University of Toronto and the University of Chicago have built upon this earlier work by examining the association between comprehensive green space metrics that we've received from the City of Toronto, particularly the density of urban street trees, and cardiovascular and metabolic disease. Headed by the University of Chicago psychologist Mark Berman, our research team focused on a large urban population, in this case it's Toronto. Using data gleaned from 30,000 individuals, we have health records from the Ontario Health Studies database, and more than 530,000 trees that the city maintains. We examined not only individual self-perceptions of health, but also heart conditions, the prevalence of cancer, mental health problems, and diabetes. Now, while self-perception of health is admittedly subjective, it does strongly correlate with objective health measures, such as the prevalence of cardiovascular disease. Our results using something called multivariate statistical analysis has shown that people that live in neighborhoods in Toronto with higher densities of trees, particularly street trees, report significantly higher health perception and significantly less cardiometabolic conditions after we've controlled for those socioeconomic conditions that we know are directly related to public health, primarily household income. Gender is also important, age is also very important. In fact, that we found that just having on average 10 more trees on a city block in Toronto improves health perception in ways that is comparable to an annual personal increase of $10,000 or moving to a neighborhood in Toronto with a higher median income of $10,000 or being 7 years younger. So what that essentially means is that the influence of tree density on self-perceptions of health as well as the occurrence of cardiometabolic disease has the same impact as if you were wealthier and if you were younger. These findings have far-reaching social and environmental justice implications. While trees and other urban green space may in fact be the great equalizers in terms of health outcomes, there is still great inequity in terms of nature access across the city and in most cities. Lower income communities and communities of color in many cities, including Toronto, are impoverished, not just economically, but also ecologically. They often lack green space and tree canopy, leading to diminished health and quality of life for local residents. Indeed, as one of my colleagues, Stephen Beta Sharper, so eloquently argued in the Toronto Star after we published our paper, quote, "Within cities, urban tree lines often follow the fault lines of social, economic, political, and ecological disparity. Just as we experience racial and economic inequality in our cities, we also experience unequal ecologies, places where people experience both economic and ecological marginalization." With 82% of Canadians now living in urban areas like Toronto, I'm encouraged by the fact that our city planners and our municipal politicians and our public health officials are actually now beginning to pay attention to this very important research, not just about the importance of urban green space to sustaining non-human biodiversity like songbirds or pollinators, but also the importance of urban green space to sustaining human biodiversity ourselves, particularly marginalized communities in the city. So we need to do three things. We need to protect the existing urban green space that exists within and around our cities. We need to design our cities in a way that restores urban green space, and we need to design our cities with green infrastructure that integrates green space into the design of our public spaces and our buildings. Continuing to ignore the green infrastructure needs of our cities, such as local parks, urban street trees, and naturalized school grounds, is short-sighted. Green spaces complement traditional infrastructure. They provide a multitude of ecological benefits for non-human biodiversity, and they contribute to the health and well-being of our local urban populations. So I'm just going to end with, this is a little Facebook post that I did back in the fall. I was traveling to York University where I teach, and I looked out the window as we were going over the Bloor Viaduct and looking northwards to that beautiful ravine that we have. And I'm always struck by the fact that, you know, Vancouver has the mountains, Halifax has the oceans, but only Toronto has this world-class ravine network that sort of wraps around our neighborhoods like a great green cloak. And so I want us to sort of think about this urban green space that we are blessed with as a critical infrastructure asset, as important as transit, as highways, as hospitals, as universities, and all the things that most municipal politicians are burdened with. So anyways, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Faisal. That was fabulous. We are going to move to our next speaker, Megan, and we're running a little bit over, so what I'm going to suggest is that we'll hear Megan's presentation, then we'll take a short break so that everyone is refreshed for our last two presenters. But I would ask our last three presenters to stick within the time frame. But we will take a short break after Megan's presentation. This is, I don't know if you guys are feeling it, but it's a lot. I've got a lot of notes here. Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm going to take the conversation up like 10,000 feet. I'm not going to talk about any specific science or any specific species. I work for an international local government association, and we do global advocacy to make sure that local governments are recognized when our nations are together discussing issues of global environmental significance. So I just want to say here that it's really great to see Toronto having this conversation here and having this theme as part of the Chief Planner Roundtable series. When you look around Canada, there is hundreds of integrated community sustainability plans done by local governments. It's quite common practice. Really well established, but the themes within them tend to be dominated by energy supply and demand, or climate change mitigation and adaptation. Stakeholder consultation is a big part of it, but biodiversity is really largely missing from those plans. And Toronto is very influential in this space. If you look back to the late 80s, Toronto was the first government in the world to set a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. Not the first city government, not the first government of all types of governments in the world. So Toronto is really influential in this space. A lot of other cities are watching this space closely. So I'm really encouraged to see biodiversity of such prevalence here. Let's see if I can figure this out. Great. So I said earlier, ICLEI is an international association of local governments committed to sustainability, and we ensure that the local level of government is recognized and empowered for their role in addressing global environmental issues. So when the nations come together to discuss the Convention on Biological Diversity, we ensure that those local government voices are heard. And so there was a big turning point in 2008 where the Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity formally recognized the promotion and engagement of cities and local authorities in this space. And this is really important because it has a trickle-down effect, right? Canada, as a federal government, has signed on to the Convention on Biological Diversity. They're formally taking action on global biodiversity concerns, and then now they have recognized that local governments have a specific role to play here. Now, you can't go to have a discussion like this without talking about the pressures of urbanization. You can't open a newspaper or click on a newspaper nowadays without seeing information about those pressures of urbanization. So globally, towns and cities are rapidly increasing in population, we know this, and urban areas are projected to triple by 2030. But most of this urbanization is in regions that are identified as biodiversity hotspots, right? So they're in areas where the impact will have a profound effect on ecological patterns and processes. And this is true in Canada, of course, too, like many other industrialized nations. We're highly urbanized. About 80% of our population is living in urban areas. But if you then start to talk about our census metropolitan areas, it's even higher, about 2/3, or maybe, sorry, just about 2/3. So it's less of a trend, I think, in Canada, more as the new normal that we're really, starting to get quite used to. So in addition to our mandate as ICLEI to do international or global advocacy, we also work with local governments to kind of raise awareness and help define how these global issues can be viewed and addressed through a local government lens. And a few years ago, we worked with TRCA on what we called a primer for local governments on biodiversity. And we had a bit of a theoretical discussion about what does it mean to be a biodiversity, right? So we brought up three kind of specific principles or themes. A biodiversity understands that a diverse natural world is the foundation of human existence and is relied upon for both survival and quality of life. Biodiversities are aware that ecosystem services contribute toward many essential municipal services, as well as towards the local economy, sustainability, and the social well-being of their cities. They provide a critical contribution to achieving global biodiversity targets, buffering further biodiversity loss, improving the urban standard of living, and providing local opportunities for global education and awareness. Now, it always helps to really dig into this issue so individuals can have an understanding of how biodiversity serves them. So sorry if this is a little difficult to read, but really highlights is there are so many key benefits that biodiversity provides in an urban setting. Probably the most obvious that people go to is the opportunities for recreational activities, ecotourism, sports, fishing, swimming, that sort of thing. But there's a big element of gas regulation, carbon sequestration from trees and oxygen and ozone protection, climate regulation. We all can talk about the urban heat island in Toronto in the summertime. And then also, this time of year, we're seeing so much flooding around Canada, and water regulation is a big component of what biodiversity provides to a city. When you think from a very specific, like what does urban biodiversity management in action look like in a city, I think this is where we start to realize that language is very important. And I think the word biodiversity doesn't always serve us well when we're engaging in a very layman's space. We're often better served to talk about nature or nature-based solutions. Biodiversity tends to be a bit heavy and scientific for a lot of people to fully understand. So, when you start talking about biodiversity in the urban governance section, you can talk about how we protect and restore natural features. We can talk about parks and green spaces, urban tree canopies. Now we can talk about, we could sort of add to this honeycomb list, talking about stormwater retention ponds and permeable pavement. It can look like a lot of things kind of under one bigger umbrella. And I actually only have one more slide. In Canada, we have the Constitution, we have the federal governments, provincial governments, and local governments are creatures of the province, right? There's only so much that's in their power to control and power to influence. And so we went through this exercise to really think about what kind of influence and authority do local governments have in this space? And we call them local action mechanisms here. And so, of course, the first one you think is around urban planning and design. Of course, there's a lot of influence here that local governments have in green route design or parks planning and building codes and ecological networks and all that sort of stuff. I think there's a deep and wide kind of area of expertise here. There's also, regulation in dealing with developers, right? Developers developing in maybe ecologically sensitive areas. Local governments have authority there that they can have some influence. We also see things like topsoil bylaws and tree protection bylaws that are really within a local government's wheelhouse to use. And then there's this space around leadership and awareness, and I think that's what we're sitting in here right now, right? We're at the Chief Planner Roundtable, and we're having this kind of open and frank kind of discussion and opportunity to kind of question things. And on YouTube, I can imagine a lot of other citizens or leaders in other local governments kind of watching this and looking for inspiration. There's certainly also community engagement and service delivery in this area. You know, we see lots of local governments doing community gardens, and they might have courses on pollinator-friendly residential gardens, because certainly there's a lot of space within a local governments that's private, and they can't sort of control what goes on there, but they have a great ability to influence in that space. And then there's also, you can think about, you know, a municipal government's operations and its workforce, you know. There's a lot of people employed by the City of Toronto, and a lot of buildings and properties that the City of Toronto manages and can do in a sustainable, biodiversity-friendly way. A lot of procurement happens, you know, within the city, and you could add a biodiversity lens to procurement policies to make sure you're purchasing products and services that, you know, operate in a biodiversity-friendly way. And then there's a workforce, you know, a workforce that you can encourage to take more biodiversity-friendly activities, even campaigns that promote biking to work and things like that. Might feel a few degrees separated, but it's still part of the wide variety of local action mechanisms at a local government's disposal. So I'll just sort of leave it there. Our website's on there. We did 3 key sort of resources and publications on to help build capacity and raise awareness on biodiversity. We did a series of case studies of what local governments across Canada are doing on the theme. I think there's 10 local governments profiled there. So lots of stuff on Montreal's ecological corridors, and about Edmonton's ravine management, and a lot of smaller communities as well. We produced the primer with TRCA so that you can download there. And then we've also done what we call a guidebook, which is more like a management framework of how a local government might oversee all of its biodiversity management practices under one kind of umbrella. So I'll leave it at that, and then turn it back over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Megan. I'm glad you've introduced the governance into the conversation, because we'll definitely pick up on that theme in our comments. I'm going to suggest we just shorten our break a tiny bit, just so we can get back on track. Let's take a 10-minute break. So we'll reconvene at just a little bit past 11:45, and we will hear from Karen. If everyone could take a seat, we're going to get started. Time for Karen's presentation. Do you have the clicker there, Karen? You do? Okay, great. And just before we begin, I'm happy to welcome Councillor Janet Davis, who has joined us. Welcome, great to have you here, Councillor. We're now going to hear from Karen. Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to focus really on local sort of things, and I really appreciate sort of the wide breadth of themes that we're discussing here today. So TRCA conservation authorities were formed in 1946 under an act of the Ontario legislature, and it was really to ensure the conservation, restoration, and responsible management of Ontario's water, land, and natural habitats through programs that balance human, environmental, and economic needs. And we're in the business of protecting, managing, and restoring our watersheds. There we go. We have a really large jurisdiction. We cover almost 3,500 square kilometers. We're the largest conservation authority by staff, and we're also the most urbanized watershed. We're also the largest landowner in the GTA, which benefits not only biodiversity, but also people too, because people can access many of these places. We have a mandate that is formed on 4 core principles, and that's healthy rivers and shorelines, green space and biodiversity, sustainable communities, and business excellence. Our watershed is very urbanized. The map here, the dark gray area, shows the real urban areas, but you'll notice that there are these threads of green through the watershed, and these are our ravine systems that have been talked about before. The map identifies our existing natural heritage system, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a moment, but if you can see sort of the light blue highlights, it also identifies potential natural heritage system, and this is really important because these are what we can build biodiversity on. You'll notice that a lot of these potential systems are east-west connections, and that's significant because most of our existing connections are north-south. They're following our ravines. But as Amy was alluding to, connections are super important, and the east-west connection is one way we can try to achieve that. These east-west connections are actually focused on utility corridors, and we're already seeing some successes here. One of those projects is the Scarborough Centre Butterfly Trail, which goes through a hydro corridor. In an urban area, we've got to deal with a lot of urban stressors, and this is just a little snapshot of some of the pressures that urban areas are under. Even though cities occupy just 3% of the Earth's surface, they're usually located in areas of ecological significance. And Toronto is testament to that. We're on the body of a Great Lake. We've got these really rich ravine systems that flow through our area. But the urbanization of our area has resulted in impaired ecosystems. And the latest Living City report card, I've got a copy here, but it's also downloadable on our website, shows that biodiversity in our area continues to decline. This is the natural heritage system that is in the City of Toronto official plan. The natural heritage system is really important because it protects biodiversity, but it also supports the enhancement and restoration of these systems. And the natural heritage system must form the building blocks of biodiversity in Toronto. And by focusing on restoration and enhancement in these areas, we can create urban biodiversity centers. And from there, biodiversity can seep into other areas. And this is where we can talk about green infrastructure and green roofs, as Scott alluded to. I wanted to just give everybody a snapshot of some of TRCA's monitoring work, looking at flora and fauna in our jurisdiction. You'll notice that all of these green dots are focused on our ravine systems, and that's because we're biased where we monitor. We're monitoring to see what these natural systems have. This is a snapshot of flora. It doesn't indicate biodiversity, but I think it indicates the potential. These are some of the species that can be found in Toronto. There are 1,155 native plant and animal species within our jurisdiction. 60% of these species are considered of regional conservation concern. This means that they're sensitive to development, they're sensitive to urbanization, they're sensitive to people. Since European arrival, we have lost 10% of our flora and 6% of our fauna from within the city of Toronto. They have disappeared entirely, and many more are hanging on just on the brink. This is a snapshot of fauna in the city, and again, we've got a bias. We're biased toward birds, and that's because birds are easy to count. They make noise, we can watch them. We're much less certain of our mammal population because they're really hard to count. They're secretive, often they're small. We can look for their footprints, but sometimes that makes it really hard to identify them. But still, we know that we've got a rich fauna diversity here, and this snapshot is, again, an example of what can be found in the city. Unfortunately, just 1/3 of the species that are native to Toronto can still be found in Toronto. And this calls us to action. It means that we have got to do more to encourage biodiversity. Building biodiversity in our natural system, I think, focuses on 3 areas. And that's protection, and I mentioned the natural heritage system. But now I want to redirect focus to restoration and enhancement. And why does restoration matter? Because if we can restore ecosystem function, we can enhance the goods and services, and we can achieve improved biodiversity. But we need to know what's going on. Science informs our restoration. This is an example of some of the studies and assessments that TRCA and our partners have undertaken. To do meaningful restoration, we need to know the impairments, we need to understand what's not working and what is working. But this is really challenging because we need more complete and consistent data. It might feel like we're monitoring all the time and that we know a lot, but I can assure you we don't. There's a lot we don't understand about biodiversity in Toronto. So we need to do better monitoring to make more informed decisions to undertake meaningful restoration. I like to think of the building blocks of biodiversity. You can't just make biodiversity. You've got to install some of the core tenets. These are the core elements that can result in healthy biodiversity within the ecosystems. We need natural cover, we need forests, we need meadows, we need wetlands. We need to make sure that our hydrology is under control, that we're controlling stormwater runoff. Our soils are so important. We cannot grow these trees if we don't have proper soils. The corridor connection, creating essential habitats like this wood duck box that replicates cavity nesting trees that have been lost in our city. And we really need public awareness and support. Nothing can be achieved unless the public knows what's going on and are advocating for the protection and restoration of biodiversity. And nothing can happen without money. We've done some work to try to figure out where we can restore. And this is a map that shows a bank. So where the opportunities lie, where potential gains can be had. You'll notice that a lot of this is focused in the rural area, and that's because we're looking again at core natural systems. And within the city of Toronto, much of that has been developed. But you'll notice a whole lot of dots on our ravine systems. And this is an opportunity to match the opportunity to restore with the opportunity, with development opportunities. We're looking at funding, we're looking at species at risk, and we're looking at other targeted enhancements. One case study that I want to draw your attention to is Tommy Thompson Park. Tommy Thompson Park is really an accident. It was never intended to be a park, but now it is. And in fact, it's probably one of the most significant natural areas on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. Through careful planning, including the Tommy Thompson Park Master Plan, as well as a couple of accompanying documents like the Natural Area Plan, we've really got a foundation here to keep developing this park into the potential that it can be. Really, natural succession has played a huge role in the development of the park, but there's also been some really strategic enhancements to just foster that along. And I'm going to point out one specific project, and that's a really lovely name of Embayment A. I'm sorry for the names. They're a relic of how the park was built. But this shoreline really lacked diversity. It has some thermal challenges in terms of its fish population, in which cold water upwellings would come in, and all of the little baby fish, the pumpkin seeds and the bass that were in there would suffer because of the cold water. So by undertaking shoreline enhancement, which was the creative reuse of dredged material, planting it up with native species, we've created a thermal refuge. We've buffering the cold water upwellings that can happen within the embayment. So now these fish are able to survive the temperature changes. We've also seen remarkable bird response to the embayment. And you can understand that by looking at the pictures. When you see all the vegetation, you can imagine that birds are much more attracted to the increased diversity of vegetation that's there now compared to what it was before. But this can't happen in absence of people. And, people often ask, what is the biggest challenge at Tommy Thompson Park? And I can tell you it's not cormorants, it's people. Both to maintain ecological integrity, the park must be managed. So that means making sure that the trail system makes sense. Trails at the park are intentionally concentrated toward the front of the park instead of toward the back of the park. And that's to keep wilderness for wildlife. Through thoughtful trail design and through park-specific policies like our no dogs policy, we're able to achieve sustainable public use. It's not perfect, but we're continuing to work toward finding that balance. And I think that Tommy Thompson Park is one of the really great testaments that Toronto has to showcase our biodiversity potential. And finally, I just wanted to leave with the notion that we need to invest in biodiversity. And one of the other panel members mentioned how we need to think about biodiversity as critical infrastructure, and I can't agree with that more. Funding is important, but it's also the investments of time, talent, creative thinking, a collaborative approach. We need to pool our resources. We need to share our ideas so that we can turn these big ideas into reality. And the needle on biodiversity isn't moving in the right direction in Toronto. We need to change that. And I look forward to working with everyone here so that we can improve biodiversity in the city.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Karen. Richard, you ready to go?
Yes, thank you. Okay, well, when we think of biodiversity in Toronto, oh boy, yeah, I got to get a hang on this thing first. Okay, well, some might think of it as in relation to natural areas of the city only. We think of it very much in terms of promoting the programs and services that protect and enhance the biodiversity of all the areas in the natural environment. So I'm thinking about streets, parks, and even private gardens, and the effect that we can have. And I hope to demonstrate that the city is a perfect classroom for this kind of work. We've got a lot of these sort of flagship sites. Tommy Thompson's certainly one of them. But this the one on the left is the whimsical sort of Franklin pollinator garden on Toronto Island, built in 2000. It was designed even engaging children. And if you go there since 2014, when we installed the pollinator station, that features some interpretive signage and selected plants to sort of tell the story of pollinators, you can just see how incredibly engaging this really is for kids and their parents. A place to learn all about the natural environment in the city and about biodiversity. Another great example is the Humber Bay butterfly habitat. It's been established since already 2002. And it was established to be a self-sustaining community of native vegetation that could be used for educational purposes and would be home to a variety of native species. Corktown Common is another site in the city right downtown. Over 700 trees and thousands of shrubs and grasses that are native to the Carolinian forest ecosystem were planned for this park and installed. And one of the really neat things that came out of this park was a new classification of park gardener. So we've created a position called organic gardener, and we've sent a lot of our staff for training on this. It's a specialized sort of science, and we give that training to our staff. We've provided that, and then if they move on to another park in the city, which we sometimes hope they do, because they're then able to send that, extend that training into other parts of the city with their colleagues. And so we're constantly doing some training as a result of just installing that park into our system. We do an incredible amount of work with a lot of different partners throughout Toronto every year. They're incredibly invaluable to maintaining and enhancing the biodiversity of the park system. They're investing so much time and energy that they become very, very committed people, and they are almost the missionaries of biodiversity and natural environment. They go home, they have these discussions around the dinner table. There's a lot of education that comes out of that kind of stewardship, working with community. We're working with residents, neighborhoods, community groups, landowners for this kind of stewardship. And it's a key method of educating people about natural areas and the challenges to sustaining them in the city. We're also aware that a lot of things happen on private property. Up on the upper right-hand side, already back in 2002, that little brochure, The Benefits of Growing Native Plants, was produced by the High Park Citizens Advisory Committee. Talks about some of the benefits, obviously, and then from that sort of came an effort to grow and distribute some of the native species that grew in the Oak Savanna and High Park. And so you'll find in that neighborhood some of those plants in people's yards. We also work with the regulators to make sure that those yards aren't full of noxious weeds and so forth, and we sometimes have to do a little education there, but that's, again, a place that a lot of extension of the natural environment takes place. We also do some garden awards. It's a sort of a healthy competition between property owners on what they're growing. There are several different categories of these gardens that people submit. Sometimes they nominate their neighbors and so on, but it's a healthy annual competition, and we bring in speakers to speak to homeowners and give them a little bit more insight into the plants that they could be using that are native to the area. There are a lot of backyards in the city as well that are an oasis. We don't even half the time know they're there, but they're there, and they're habitat for a lot of different species of fauna as well, and creating little linkages throughout the city. Our urban forestry folks are very much into native street tree biodiversity. Think about 5,600 kilometers or so of streets that are through Toronto, many of them lined with trees. And so it's really important to have native trees there, and here's why. We did some work a number of years ago with a PhD candidate at the time, Eric Davies from the University of Toronto, Faculty of Forestry. He just looked at comparing the number of insects that are in native trees versus non-native trees, and it was shocking to learn that there are about 25 times more wildlife in native trees versus non-native trees. So you can imagine what an effect native street trees even have on biodiversity. Forestry is currently developing new tree species guidelines that'll help guide species selection. It will be documenting the species used and collecting and analyzing data on survival. They're also working on a new program to try and support planting of trees in backyards, even on private property through the city. Generally, we've been planting a lot more trees and shrubs through the city. You can see the upper photograph there is sort of a mown turf environment that had just been planted up in 2003, and you can see it in the lower photograph, 2014. This is the Winston Churchill Reservoir. And it's a lot different because there are a lot of native species of shrubs and trees that have been planted there, excuse me, and that we're planting somewhere in the neighborhood of 110, 120,000 trees and shrubs a year throughout the park system and on streets in Toronto. We certainly have a lot of challenges. Emerald ash borer alone, if you look at it, there was a study, there are approximately 1,000 species associated with just ash, including 12 types of bird, 55 types of mammals, and 239 insects, and over 100 of them are dependent entirely on ash. So the removal of this genus from our landscape is going to have a profound effect, and it's certainly a challenge. And then the middle photograph there, the Asian longhorn beetle, we worked with the Canadian Forest Service and CFIA and other partners, TRCA, and we developed in Toronto what is now a world practice for eradication of Asian longhorn beetles. So we do have success on a challenge. And then the gypsy moth, we have methods in forestry of monitoring and finding out where the hot spots are, the very aggressive population growth. And we have methods to control those outbreak populations before they do permanent damage to a lot of our large mature oak trees. A lot of disturbances are of just heavy use, recreation, loving a park to death, flooding because of the way that our hydrology has been altered so much to become, transforming creeks into stormwater channels, really. These have huge impact on the natural environment and the biodiversity and our ability to sustain it. But you can see the influx then of dog strangling vine, Himalayan balsam, and some 19 other herbaceous species and 10 shrub species that we're monitoring throughout the city. On the left, we've got some success too, though, and that's we've learned how to treat dog strangling vine, and you can see the photos below it then become savanna. We're doing that through various methods, prescribed burning, planting, selective herbicide treatments, and so on. On the right, a riparian area that is all Himalayan balsam, and we converted that all into native species of riparian. There we go. In Toronto, we've got a lot of mapping of our 86 environmentally significant areas in the natural heritage system. That's really important too, because we're working together with city planning on just knowing where everything is and then being able to document the significant features, working on the development of best management practices, turning that into staff training so that we know we're doing the right thing in the right place. Developing practices to regulate park use so we don't love these areas to death, and so on. That's all a very important part of preserving biodiversity. It's been mentioned already, but the Toronto Biodiversity Series that City Planning has led has been an incredible tool. This has raised the bar of understanding biodiversity here in Toronto in the Toronto-centric context. It's really important. They're made available to schools, libraries, and to our staff, and we do a lot of training with this with a view to advancing our knowledge and how we develop skills and ultimately protect and enhance biodiversity in Toronto. We've got the pollinator strategy. It's been mentioned before. That's just an example of one that Parks, Forestry, and Rec has worked with other divisions on, the Toronto Environment and Energy Office, for example. And this will change the way that we practice horticulture in our traditional horticultural beds throughout the city, and we've already begun training on that. The ravine strategy, there isn't enough time to go into it here, but we've talked about it today. The ravine systems are an incredible resource in Toronto, and this strategy, which will be coming out to Executive Committee and Council later this summer, is all about protecting the feature and the ecology there, investing and making the connections throughout the city, and partnering with others that also have similar interests, and then celebrating what goes great. And there are 20 actions associated with that strategy, and that'll be coming out later. So to wrap up, I just want to say that biodiversity is critical to life. We are concerned about it, And Parks, Forestry, and Rec, together with the other partners, we try to stay abreast of all the issues, the challenges, and the science. We're working with interest with many stakeholders and the public, young and old, because they are the champions and they will carry this forward. We do a lot of teaching and mentoring, and we're very passionate about protecting and enhancing the natural environment and upholding the official plan to protect and enhance the natural environment and biodiversity in Toronto. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. There's an incredible richness in what's being presented here today, and what I'd like to do is take the lens back out and ask a question that all of you, I'm sure, are going to want to answer. And it's one of the key questions that was raised in one of our comments from the floor, which is really about, it's about balancing competing interests, and that can help the sustainability of cities. And this is something that we struggle with limited resources. You can't do everything. How do you know where to begin? And so the question that I'd like to ask is, where do we begin? What do we need to do first? What do we need to do most? And in some ways, I love it that all of you come from slightly different practices or disciplinary lenses, and I'd like you each to make the case. Where should we be putting our greatest level of effort? And whoever would like to go first is welcome to just go ahead. Scott?
Why not? Well, there's certainly a lot of things we need to do, and it's, again, encouraging to see so many people here with diverse work experiences trying to tackle these issues. But in my own research, again, I'm very interested in citizen science and how the public can inform my own research, inform different questions that we can start to pursue collaboratively, both with research, again, with the public involved. And one thing that we have been thinking a lot about is trying to mainstream these ideas. And so it's very easy to talk to a gardening group, a horticultural society, a community that's thinking about bees and nature and plants, perhaps in their own work or in their own time outside of work. And the idea that the accountant, the butcher, the individual working in an office tower can have an impact on biodiversity in their city is something that's not sometimes obvious to people who don't have those immediate links to biodiversity and green space in cities in their work, life, and play. And so trying to mainstream this idea of biodiversity and how we all do have direct and indirect impacts on the nature in our city, and trying to encourage people to do a bit of brainstorming and thinking again how their particular activities in work, in life, in recreation, and so on can have an impact. It can be quite resounding. So trying to reach, again, it's really easy to talk about green space and biodiversity and bees and why they matter in the city to people who have open ears to that. And so trying to find ways to engage people who this isn't on their radar for whatever reason, I think is really key.
So I'm going to come back to the theme of education, which is something that each one of you is deeply immersed in, but I think that's part of what you're pointing to. Any others? The place to start? Go ahead, Megan.
I think one of the best places to start is just around the process of target setting. So set some targets. I couldn't say what those should be. I think there's a lot of experts in the room that would know, like, what species to set targets around and things like that. But set those targets, but establish a process for tracking those targets and reporting against those targets and updating those targets. So then, it'll be a messy process. You won't hit all your targets, but you'll refine and update along the way, and that ensures like there's an effort of continuous improvement that's established in local government policy and practice.
Great, thank you. Others? Go ahead, Karen.
Jennifer, you had mentioned competing interests and competing priorities, and I think that is a really huge challenge. But I think there might be some simple tasks that, that can be undertaken to try to coordinate better. You know, Kelly and I have talked about this in the past, but you know, activities where infrastructure, you know, buried infrastructure needs to get rehabbed, replaced, whatever, if we can link nature to that infrastructure. So when a street needs to be turned up for infrastructure replacement, let's go back in there and let's install the soils and let's install the trees to try to make all of these connections happen. And I think we need big ideas, but I think we need to start simply.
Well, that's so, looking at the street design, it's very interesting that you put that in the simple category. I do not put that in the simple category. But maybe we'll come back to that, because one of the other themes I do want to pick up on is infrastructure. Faisal.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been somewhat alarmed by is the manner in which the environment is oftentimes relegated far down the list of priorities. It's typically the poorest funded part of the bureaucracy, and it's oftentimes seen as somewhat marginal to the priorities of city builders. And the case that myself and some of my colleagues have been trying to make is that the green space of the city and the biodiversity that is found therein are critical infrastructure components of the city. They are as important as transit, healthcare, education, and such. And so when we are talking about planning in these other areas, we need to actually think about how would green space be relevant to those goals and objectives. So I'm very encouraged to see in the City of Toronto, for example, that green infrastructure is relevant. It's very much relevant in terms of the conversation that's going on around how to manage stormwater, for example. I'm very encouraged by the fact that there's a growing recognition that green space has a very important role to play in terms of public health and achieving public health outcomes, and in fact may actually be a more cost-effective means by which to achieve some health outcomes related to, say, encouraging more cardiovascular driven exercise. I will raise, as I talked in my talk, the issue of equity I think is really, really critical. And I think we have not traditionally thought of the fact that there is great inequity in terms of where the green space is found and who has access to green space and who has access in terms of managing that green space. And we don't want to create a city whereby there are communities that are left behind when it comes to ensuring these investments in green space and access to green space. And sort of thinking of green space as being one of the great equalizers that could potentially bring all communities along. So, yeah.
Great. It always ends up, the conversation always ends up coming back to what's funded and what's not funded. It's inevitable that we end up going there. And you know, with good reason, if you don't have the resources attributed to delivering, you're simply not going to see it happen. On the flip side, one of the things that I think has been an important theme today is the way that partnerships have been leveraged, and in particular, the way that partnerships have been delivered in order to create knowledge and to educate the public. So, but I think the point is well taken. Others? Amy?
If I can, I'd like to add on to that idea of competing or contrasting priorities, which I think is really important. Sometimes what I see is that there's a disconnect between what people see biodiversity or green spaces meaning to them versus what the science is telling us. So I really liked Dave's talk on marketing science because I think it's important to bring those two together. So a green space isn't just a space that is green. It has to be functioning. It has to have diversity of habitat to it to support these animals. And sometimes that means that we can't be there. So there have to be areas that are dedicated to supporting these species that are isolated partly from our presence. And that's something that I think if it's understood by all of the stakeholders, then it's something that can be set as a target. But without this understanding, then we might be striving for, you know, these idealized objectives of green spaces that maybe not actually serve their function.
So important point and links into what Megan was talking about. It's difficult to talk about the target setting and the measures when we don't have clarity about the shared objectives. We have to figure out, and figure out how we define those shared objectives. The precursor to the question that I just asked you from the comment that we received on the floor, I'd just like to read it to you because it puts this into really sharp focus, and particularly your comment, Amy. In some areas of the city, like Bloor West, there has been a lot of pushback against incoming added density, in this case along the subway line. Among other reasons, the impact to ecologically sensitive areas of High Park has been cited in opposition to this population growth. And I think that is a really poignant example of the tension that we face in the city, and it's a very real one. We have a lot of pressure right now to be putting more housing in a lot of our neighborhoods and making those neighborhoods denser. When we do, we lose our tree canopy because on the one hand, a large part of the city that is low density is also where we have a tremendous amount of permeable surface and where we have a very, very rich tree canopy. So should we be densifying those areas, cutting down the trees, adding more housing? There's an ecological trade-off to doing so. That's a very real tension that isn't currently yet at the forefront of the conversation, but I think I think this question really captures poignantly the tension that we're struggling with in our city and what the right balance is. Did you want to weigh in, Dave, on this question?
Sure. I could probably bring some circularity to it. I think Scott hit the nail on the head. When you look at international governments, United Nations, the IUCN, at the global level, at the national level, at the provincial level, at the regional level, the answer has already been provided for us. We need to mainstream biodiversity. It underpins everything else that we're saying. If the public doesn't understand what this is, they will not advocate for it. So they will not drive funding, they will not drive priority, they will not drive minutia. And the public doesn't understand this. You guys are probably all pretty hardcore biodiversity nuts. And 9 times out of 10, 9.5 times out of 10, I speak to audiences who are already converted. But there's 7 million people in Toronto, and 90% of them don't even understand what the word biodiversity means. We need to start there. We desperately need to start there, and we need to market science better, or none of your other initiatives will actually take hold.
Well, you made that point quite poignantly with your endearing salamander, which is really a very slimy creature. But the doughy-eyed salamander, I think, is much better approach than roadkill. I think, absolutely. Richard, do you want to weigh on this?
A little bit. I think sometimes we forget that we need to look at some of the frontline influencers. And for example, let's take retailers in the garden sector. Still selling a lot of invasive species and so forth. That's a place where we could do a little education and have a profound effect, not only within what the government does, but also what the private sector does. If we equip them with simple information, such as the brochures that I mentioned and other things that people have done great work on, that's very effective. Give that away at the garden centers. We did years ago in Toronto, we did a deal with Loblaws, and we had the city foresters pick, and I had to pick a number of different tree species that were native at the time, and I believe my colleague Jason Doyle is doing that right now again, but I'm not sure. But Loblaws then started selling these native trees as opposed to whatever other species they were selling before, and they went by the droves. And that was a really neat thing. And then to that notion of targets are really, at the grassroots level, they can be pretty simple to do. Like communities could say 1 out of every 10 gardens in our neighborhood should have native trees or plants in it by year X. And they can do that at that level, and creates a healthy tension in the neighborhood, a sort of a little pressure of neighbors on neighbors. And just to that point you made, Jennifer, about the density, that kind of tension, there's always this tension between how much do you build and then how much pressure does that bring to the local ravine or park or whatever and anything natural within it. And what's that sustainability threshold? And if you're in this industry and you talk about sustainability threshold, what we mean is if once you pass a certain point, all of a sudden everything just goes terrible really fast. And there's no amount of work that you can do that'll bring it back anytime soon, back to a healthy state. That's always the danger. And so what that demands of us is that we do not just good, but great design and construction when we, try to protect our soils under the sidewalks, setbacks, different things, and also within the park spaces. To the point Karen made, keeping people at the front rather than way out in the back of those green spaces, just to try and protect them. You can still tell the story. You can still do all the great work. It just has to be done planned.
So I'd like to pick up on a few themes here, and it really links into something I've heard from everyone in what the priority must be. And it gets back to a word or a term that I think is sort of inside baseball, which is ecological services. Like, I don't know if that's an intuitive term, but the first time I heard it, which was probably relatively recently, I went, ecological services. What could that possibly mean? And yet, it's something in our policy, in every tree counts, we talk about ecological services. It's been mentioned several times in the presentations today. And on one hand, it seems to me that ecological services is a way of trying to appropriate the idea that nature has a value in terms of habitats that we can quantify in such a way as making an argument for their value. And so we've kind of adopted this language of ecological services to say, well, nature is serving us, it's giving us something. Because it's giving us something, we should make sure that we're investing in it, that it delivers on something. And I just want to throw out to the group, I just want to question actually whether that's a good model. And I think, Faisal, you would probably, I'm going to actually start with you because I think you've made the case that part of it is about establishing value. And I'm wondering whether ecological services is the right way to articulate that value, whether that doesn't just sort of keep it all inside baseball, as opposed to serving the purpose of broadening the conversation. And then there's another part of this, which is, to your point, Richard, how do we figure out when we're hitting the tipping point in terms of how we're building our urban environments, where we're compromising what we need from the living systems in our city versus being able to add more density? Because there's a tipping point. And I don't know, to Megan's question, can that be measured? Do we have ways of quantifying that? At what point have we taken down one too many neighborhood trees? So I'll begin with you, Faisal.
So there's no truly right way to value a forest or a river, but God knows there's a wrong way, which is to give it no value whatsoever when we make decisions that could degrade or destroy natural places. And the problem is that's exactly what we do. So typically when we make decisions that could adversely impact green space, we give no value, no explicit value to those benefits that are provided to us as local residents. And as a consequence, we oftentimes make perverse decisions that result in increased costs to society. More greenhouse gas emissions, dirtier water, dirtier air, fewer opportunities for our children to have an opportunity to interact with biodiversity. So I feel very strongly that the idea of trying to communicate ecological services is really critical because it helps decision makers make decisions better and fully understand the true suite of benefits that green space provides beyond just having habitat value from some incredibly rare and esoteric plant or animal. And I'm encouraged by the fact this is already happening. So for example, the Suzuki Foundation did the first natural capital valuation of any large region. It was done for the Greenbelt region. More recently, TD Bank has done a very important accounting system for city street trees. I would go one step further, which is that I would love to see the city then, by using that information, explicitly recognize these things as assets on our books in the same way that we would recognize the transit system or any other form of critical infrastructure, and then manage it as an asset that we want to sustain well into the future, and resource it appropriately, in the same way that we would resource maintaining the gardener so that it doesn't fall on top of our heads. Thanks.
So I think in our ravine strategy, we're actually taking a step in that direction. That's where we're going. I'm wondering, is there a jurisdiction in the world that does this really well that we can learn from?
So ironically, it's the small little town that I'm from, which is Gibsons, British Columbia. So those of you who are at least 40 years old or older, like myself, will know the Beachcombers. That's where it was shot. And Little Gibsons, our little town, was the first jurisdiction in Canada that has actually now recognized the natural capital assets that our little town has, which is this incredible old growth forested watershed. So all our water comes from. It's the best water in the country. You know, you can just go to a stream and take it right out. And so as the city planning department is making decisions, we now have to explicitly account for the potential impact on that as an asset. And there's a number of other pilot communities that are doing it. One, City of Vancouver is moving very quickly to that as well, and setting targets for those natural capital assets in terms of things like canopy cover or such.
Others on the question of this language? Dave and then Megan.
I'll just say that Gibson's had a very helpful hand in that you live there. That was amazing. But I would absolutely agree with Jennifer. The term ecological services is the one that the industry is using right now. And it's very explanatory. It's exactly what Fazal just pointed out. But I think we need to rethink how we're branding this piece. And it goes back to my and Scott's point about mainstreaming biodiversity. It is the ticket into success through funding, through businesses, through the folks who are controlling money. If we can show services have definite value, then it's a win-win. But a very quick point that we just need to think of a new way, and we have some ideas at the ROM around what is, how do you define, what's the word, what's the phrase, what's the brand for ecological services?
Great, Megan.
What I really loved about the value of trees in the City of Toronto, that report that TD Economics put out, was that it brought a whole set of different stakeholders into that kind of conversation, right? That report didn't come out of their Green Foundation. It came out of TD Economics, which, we hadn't seen them talking about natural capital ever. And so that got very different media attention. It got very different, people around the table buzzing about this. And I'm sure you could argue whether or not their validation was appropriate or not, but that's the really interesting conversation, right? And that's what I find really wonderful about these evaluation projects, is it gives you something to discuss with a whole new set of people.
Mm-hmm. Great. Do others want to comment on that, on Scott?
Do you mind? Yeah. I think the discussion around ecosystem services is actually quite useful, especially in the context of cities. As an ecologist, we can often use the term ecosystem services and ecosystem functions interchangeably. And what an ecosystem function is interactions in nature that begets productivity, that begets persistence of natural communities. And so for those of us interested in how an ecosystem is performing or how stable or resilient it is, by actually measuring the underlying mechanisms that drive pollination services or water cleaning or air purification and so forth, can be a really, really nice model for investigation, again, as a measurement of how performative a particular system is and how well it's doing. But one cautionary bit here is increasingly the industry and other organizations are able to use the term ecosystem service to sell or to convey the environmental attitude or quality of a particular product or service or building or landscape. And so we always have to be very mindful about the concept of greenwashing when we are using terms around biodiversity and ecosystem services when we're planning the city of the future. And so there's a kind of a pro and a con.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on because I do think language is really, really important. Everyone has identified as a theme the importance of education. And education at a very basic level is about broadening the conversation. It's about bringing more people into the conversation in new ways. I'm glad you raised the TD Economics report, because when that report came out, I remember seeing it and going, hey, look what they did. And I had that reaction, was that this wasn't, with all due respect, a bunch of ecologists telling me about the value of trees. It was economists telling me about the value of trees in the systems in the city. And it felt pivotal. It felt like a pivot. It felt like a shift in the conversation. So the question I'd like to throw out to this group, getting back to this idea that I'm very confident, particularly with the expertise around this table, that we're going to continue to do really great work in understanding the systems that we need to understand so that we can plan them better. The question is really, it seems to me, the question of value. How do we establish the value very broadly, politically? How do we establish the value in communities? How do we establish the value for children who may never touch the mud or the dirt or put their hand in a stream, let alone drink directly from the stream? And it is about language. It is about broadening the stakeholder conversation. And I'd like to just throw this out, because each one of you has identified this importance of mainstreaming this conversation. Who are some of the partners that aren't yet at the table, that need to be at the table in order to begin creating this wave of value around biodiversity in our cities? Do you want to begin, Richard?
Very short comment. I'm really glad that Faisal brought in the mental wellness and other health benefits of the environment earlier. And to your question, the medical officer of health has done a study. It's about 2 years old now, and it was a literature review and a whole document describing the benefits of natural environment. And it's a tremendous document. There's just so much sort of spin-off ecological service that's provided by having a healthy environment.
So health is like a big one, a really, really big driver. And most people at a very personal level can feel that as an access point into the conversation, and in particular the mental health and well-being. Others, Karen?
Well, I think that it comes back to what I think Dave and Scott had mentioned about mainstreaming, and it's about ecological literacy. So, you asked Jennifer who's not at the table. I think a lot of people are not at the table. And I think it's because people don't care. They don't care because they don't understand. And when you talk about industry, it comes down to the bottom line. So we've got to show, like through the TD report, that ecological services impact bottom lines. And I think if you can demonstrate that, and unfortunately it does come down to valuation of things, you've got to show the dollars and cents and make the connection, and that it's not just a nebulous idea out there. This is real hardcore services that if we remove them, it's going to cost us money.
Well, I think one of the challenges we face as well is that when we do this kind of planning right, like so many other things in planning, it's completely unseen. So if we think about the incredible strategy around the riverbanks following Hurricane Hazel, we can't today imagine what the flooding would be like in this city this spring if that strategy hadn't been implemented. We just take for granted the fact that most of the city isn't flooding right now, despite the fact that the water table is exceptionally high. So there's this, I think one of the challenges that we face is that when this work is done well, it's incredibly unseen because everyday life continues. How do we tell the story better, I think is part of the question. Do others want to comment on this? making.
I was going to add another player to be around the
Yes.
table, are the provincial and federal municipal associations, in that they're, the voice of local governments to the provinces and to the federal government. And they're often the ones consulted when there's new funding streams coming to municipalities. They're the ones consulted to determine what the terms of that funding is. So like when the gas tax, about 10 years ago, there was a new gas tax, piece of the gas tax that would go to local governments. The provincial associations were there at the table determining what would be required of the local governments to get that share of the gas tax through the sustainability plans that they developed. But there was no biodiversity elements within those sustainability plans, right? So, and then the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, they're the ones that have very successfully in the last few years secured more funds to support municipal climate implementation funding. And we're not seeing biodiversity at the table there yet. So those two types of organizations, as well as like the Big City Mayors Caucus that is organized by the FCM group, really powerful leadership coming out of there that can help influence how funds come to support this work.
Fabulous, and maybe the City of Toronto can play a role, I think, in facilitating that. In particular, our political leaders, particularly the two who are in the room, because they have a voice. They have a voice at those tables. Dave?
So just 2 quick points around how do you tell this story, and answering Jennifer's first question. So, the word of the year in 2016 on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, which is absolutely rare. I think it's only happened twice in history of this. The UK and the US both chose the word post-truth. The idea is that our audiences, who again are totally unaware of what we're talking about, are reacting to emotion. They're reacting against evidence-based policy. They are reacting against a lot of the reports I read, with all due respect, coming out of municipal and provincial governments, are speaking languages that are automatically turning our audiences off. We need to create stories about these issues that pull and tug on people's emotional interests. Thus, this whale poo story I'm telling right now, I am getting a ton of mileage out of this because it's got a great title, but really it's a metaphor. It's not about whale poo. There's no cetaceans in Lake Ontario. This is about connectivity of our systems and that they're all interconnected. So park that. I think we need to figure out the stories that we're inherently wanting to tell, but we need to think of new ways to tell them that address this idea of post-truth. And then secondly, our target audience right now, almost entirely with all of the 10 or 12 programs I'm running, is the millennial audience. By 2030, they will make up more than 50% of the workforce in Canada. They are the future, and they are not listening to us at all. They are turning off, and they are getting their information madly and instantly via the internet. And for the most part, although there's a lot of millennials even in this room right now who are convicted environmentalists, what I'm talking about are new immigrants, the 6.5 million people in Toronto in the millennial or in the GTA population who don't have this background or coming from poverty it's not a priority for them. So we need to think of ways to tackle the millennial audience and get this story to them.
So, and I wonder if that doesn't come back to, because I think this story can't resonate if there isn't some kind of touch point. And it strikes me that it can't be a coincidence that this conversation isn't resonating with the demographic that primarily grew up in hard surface suburbs. Millennials grew up in suburbs. They're choosing to live in a much more urban way. But it gets back to things like, I think, our ravine strategy, which is all about trying to get people into our systems. And to the equity point, it's interesting in Toronto because most of our priority neighborhoods are on ravines. We actually don't have that because so many of our neighborhoods are mixed, even in our suburbs. We have very high income neighborhoods, cheek and jowl with very poor neighborhoods. They're all one neighborhood, and so there's a similar level of access between demographic groups. The question is about figuring out how to actually get people. So I don't think it's just about a story, although the story is important. It's also about experience, because I think if people don't actually understand or experience or touch the trees and the earth, the relevance of it. You know, if you don't understand where the water goes down the drain, who cares that you're wasting lots of water or how that water got into the drain? So I do think there's two sides of this that need to kind of emerge concurrently. I'd like to also pick up on, I think it might have been Richard who was talking about industry and the connection between the bottom line. And I loved your story about City of Toronto partnering with Loblaws and Loblaws bringing in native species, and boom, people are planting native species. I think that's just a brilliant example of how you can actually drive the output in the city in a really explicit way. As everyone's been talking, I've been thinking about, well, where have we done this before? And one of the places where we've actually done a pretty good job of building a narrative across industries, disciplines, sectors, and interests is around the priority for investment in transit. The Board of Trade says the same thing that Code Red or other agencies say, not-for-profit agencies, municipalities, the priority of building transit. We're not having a debate as to whether transit should be our priority in this, and that's actually new. And I was in Australia a couple years ago and was shocked that they're having a big debate about whether they should build highways or transit, and I went, wow, we've actually crossed that threshold in Toronto. We're having other challenges about what we should build and how we're going to fund it, but we're not debating whether transit is a good thing anymore. And it struck me that we haven't actually, with respect to biodiversity, we're not there yet. We're not there where we're recognizing it as being a critical part of our city building yet. The narrative hasn't gotten to that point yet, and all of us will play a role in advancing that.
I totally agree with you, and I think, you know, one of the reasons for that is that businesses understand that they suffer in terms of productivity if they don't get behind the idea of investment in transit. The same argument can be made about green space. And one of the things that the City of Vancouver has done really well is that, in part, by branding themselves around a work-life balance that benefits from this amazing green space that we have access to, we attract investment. We attract, people want to live in Vancouver, notwithstanding the real estate challenges, and there's loads of other challenges as well. But it's part of the brand of the city. The city has done a very effective job at communicating the fact that this is a great place to live, in part because you have access to an amazing green space. So Toronto also benefits from that. You know, we are the most forested city in the country. We do have this incredible network of ravines, which, one of the lovely things about it is that they literally wrap and permeate every neighborhood. You know, you were so close to access points. And I think that coming out of the ravine strategy, my real hope is that it becomes part of the brand of the city. In the same way that we're trying to brand the city in other ways, as a hub for innovation or social entrepreneurship and such. I also want to add just a brief little point, which is I think education is really, really critical. I think it's very, very important. At the same time, I do not want to dismiss the value of good regulation and getting out ahead and being leaders and, you know, putting on that suit of armor and being willing to go out there and lead with strong policy that is going to address the decline in biodiversity. And, you know, with all respect, I mean, Jennifer, that's what you've done. Like, you've done that really effectively when it comes to protecting the greenbelt, investing in bike lanes and other forms of active transportation, promoting densification. You know, it wasn't like, let's step back and let's ask everybody what they think about these things. It was like, let's get ahead and do this stuff. And we can do that. So, for example, the City of Montreal, the City of Vancouver, they have banned the use of neonicotinoid pesticides, in part because these are pesticides that are particularly dangerous to pollinators. A lot of it is from the horticultural side. So there are plants that are grown with neonicotinoids that are planted in the City of Toronto that actually adversely impact pollinators. Similarly, there have been other efforts to regulate bad things out of the environment that we know hurt biodiversity, while at the same time creating those incentives, those non-regulatory incentives, working with the Loblaws of the world, which I would never dismiss. I think that's very, very important, to bring industry on as well.
So you just made a lot of people happy with your comments, because there's a lot of policy folks in the room. And from our perspective, well, we've seen this with our green roofs, right? The industry kicked and screamed and said the green roof policy would freeze development in the city. How did that go? How did that go? Didn't make a dent, and in fact, very quickly, those green roofs became an asset that was advertised and recognized really broadly as contributing value to the overall project. So I think it's very important that in addition to thinking about the narrative and the experience and the access, that the role of policy and the role of advancing really strong policy is a critical piece of this puzzle. And I'll just flag, because we in fact are working on a biodiversity strategy, and this is being led by Kelly Snow, which is precisely that, which is about creating that policy strategy that will be about long-term protection and enhancement of the city's native flora and fauna. And it's really about ensuring that we pick up on some of the themes that we've identified in the context of the ravine strategy, which are about protecting as well as enhancing, ensuring through the ravine strategy that our environmentally sensitive areas have management strategies. That's the policy to really deliver on the promise in terms of the work that we do as a municipality. We're almost out of time. What I'd like to do is just give each one of our panelists a moment to just say a closing word, if you would like to. Just a couple of sentences, just a closing thought that you might have, either something that you didn't get a chance to contribute or something that you'd just like to highlight as really the key message that you want both Councillor Doucette and Councillor McMahon to hear, also for the city staff who do write the policy, for me to hear. If you have just a key statement that you'd like to leave us with as a thought that can't be missed in moving forward and thinking about how we advance biodiversity in the city, would love to hear what that is. And I think what I'll do is I'll start on this side of the room and just go around. So Megan, you'll go first.
I just want to say that I'm so pleased to hear the City of Toronto talking about this, because when I started my intervention at the beginning, I said that other local governments around the world are watching, right? And so I continue to see the message keep coming out at elected official levels, at staff levels, with the biodiversity strategy that's coming out. I think it's going to really have an effect on how local governments around the world are planning for biodiversity.
Great, thank you. Dave?
I just want to shout out to the last point that you made, and Kelly and your team of policy. They're amazing. I think they're totally amazing. I've been working with Kelly for 10 years now, and certainly I do see a huge value in good, sound policy that's based on evidence and science, without a doubt. My last word would be, we need to translate those. We need to translate those ideas better.
Great, thank you. Amy?
I would just like to say that it's very encouraging to me to be in a room full of people that have such great ideas on how to advance biodiversity in the city. This is something that I can really bring back to the students that I teach, that are going to be our next generation of scientists, policymakers, et cetera. And it would be really great to see this kind of shift in thinking, where instead of we build a structure and maybe identify that it's harming biodiversity in some way, and then we go and try to fix it, to instead looking a step ahead and saying, before we build this, what can we do differently so that we don't have to do something afterwards? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Scott?
Just building on some of the conversation that's come up already with respect to kids and younger generation and how they are perceiving nature and the shifting baseline that's occurring. This idea of nature deficit disorder as a driver in creation of green space and increasing access to all of Torontonians to that green space. Down on the waterfront, we're seeing, more than 60% of condo dwellers more than 60% of families living in condos downtown. And so increasing access to nature for children and really trying to hit home the importance of biodiversity in that relationship to spur creativity and emotion and human health and well-being and inspiration. I think biodiversity is the missing link to the nature deficit disorder conversation, and the City of Toronto is doing a great job with that.
Well, I just wanted to thank you. I think this is a phenomenal opportunity. The City of Toronto is leading in so many places when it comes to sustainability, integrating sustainability into planning. And I have, full confidence in your leadership and of that of your staff and the political leadership in the city. and working from a position of strength. And for me, one of the big pieces of that is our ravine network, and using that ravine network as a jumping off point to start addressing biodiversity needs in other parts of the city as well.
Thanks, Basil. Karen?
Biodiversity is about connecting. It's about connecting people with nature. It's about connecting nature with nature. And I think that Toronto can be a trendsetter here, and I'd like to see the interconnectedness highlighted. I think maybe we need to invite some psychologists and sociologists around this table to try to help us figure out how we can message this. Thank you for this.
Great, thank you. Richard?
Sometimes those of us that are watching and in this room that are working so hard to try to protect and enhance biodiversity feel like, we're at least trying to be on the leading edge, but it can feel a little bit like you're on the bleeding edge. And that hurts. So I think it's really important that we do celebrate our successes. There are a lot of them, and there are a lot of people investing a lot of time and energy to the point where it hurts, but they're so invested, and they will continue working on it, and we need to celebrate that.
Great, thank you. I would love to invite Councillor Doucette and Councillor McMahon to say a few words.
I'm sorry, I can't come to something like this and not ask to speak. Thank you, everybody. I just want to touch on a couple of things we talked about. We've come across a glitch. I have High Park in my area. We're doing an avenue study on Bloor Street. We're doing a character study in the apartment neighborhood. We have 2 towers being built right now, 5 possibly coming in. But there wasn't a study to do High Park because it's not being developed on. So city staff are working outside the box. So I know it would be in the ravine strategy, but how can we fit that in with an avenue study and a character study? So we need to work on those. Transform TO, brilliant. Worked on it as a subcommittee since day one. Staff works so hard. We've got to put the money to it, though. That's our biggest problem. Competing interests, High Park example, we have to protect it, our ESAs, with off-leash dogs, on-leash dogs, football, baseball, you name it. We've got to work on the OMB. The OMB right now dictates what gets built in this city, and that shouldn't be allowed. I'm going really quickly here, you notice. And one thing Richard didn't comment, he was about to hold up the report in front of him. Yeah. We have just done a motion to say that the city may not purchase seeds or plants with the neonico thing, which I can never pronounce. That is in that report. We put that motion forward. It's done. The city will not be buying them anymore.
Ditto, ditto, ditto. Thank you so much for coming. Love the information, love the stories, Mr. Ireland. I'm a story girl, and you need to make it resonate with people because it seems abstract to them. I'm the eternal optimist, so I'm going to end on optimism and start on optimism. We have a Raindrop Plaza coming in Wonderful Ward 32, which is going to happen at Coxwell and Dundas, one of the world's ugliest intersections. No offense to the intersection, but we have the ROM involved, we have U of T involved, Carleton University involved. People in Paris apparently are keen on this. It's the first of its kind, a stormwater demonstration site in the city of Toronto. We're bringing in our First Nations schools to help with Indigenous artwork. It's got everything, the whole package, and it's going to be the go-to spot in the neighborhood, and I think actually in your neighborhood. And Sheila Boudreau, wherever she is, Green Street's queen, she's Sheila. She does not, you cannot have a conversation with Sheila without Raindrop Plaza popping in to whatever topic it is, dinner party, wherever it is. So that's great. Transform TO, we're going to get that through council, hopefully, unanimously, and then get some bloody funding for it next year. And ravine strategy and our tree planting on city or on private lands is fantastic. And trees as assets, absolutely, that needs to be categorized, and Gibson, BC is not only famous for trees, but for best apple pie in Canada at one point. But that, we continually have to argue and educate our colleagues at council on the value of a tree, which is horrific. We just need to bring in the Lorax and just have them have a seat at a council seat. But you're all doing great work. We love you guys, and keep it going.
Thank you very much to both Councillor Duzette and Councillor McMahon. I have a few other thank yous just before we leave. I'd like to thank the team that has pulled together this roundtable. They do a tremendous amount of work on top of the rest of their portfolio to make these conversations successful and to ensure that people are aware of them and to find truly the best experts with respect to every topic. So I would like to thank Adriana Soyek. Adriana, you can wave your hand. Adriana does all of the administration with respect to the Chief Planner Roundtables, and she continues to do an exceptional job. So thank you, Adriana. Your work is deeply appreciated. We also have sitting beside Adriana is Bruce. Bruce is from Strategic Communications, helping us with letting people know this is happening, with the tweeting, with all the technical parts. Bruce, thank you very much for all your contributions. Tony Papa, Rosemary Ustance are also important players in delivering on the roundtable. And then I have my small but mighty environmental policy team sitting over on this side of the room, Jane, Shauna, Sheila, Kelly. I have to say that when people see how small my team is on environmental policy, they're always flabbergasted because of the magnitude that the heavy lifting that this team does. And I also just want to say that, you know, we're a pretty big organization. In city planning, we have transit planning, transportation planning, heritage. There's a whole variety of different pieces that need to come together. And even within our larger team, we struggle to push the environmental agenda to the fore of all of our conversations because there's a lot of competing interests within the division. So I just want to give a shout out to this team for the great work that they do. They've done an exceptional job in facilitating, bringing all of you into the room and making this conversation happen. And lastly, a thank you to our panelists. And I have a special gift that is very much in keeping with Richard's comment about really celebrating our successes. I have a copy for each of you of Burkhart's new book, hot off the press, The Green Belt. And for those of you who have not seen this book, it takes away the sting of some of that bleeding that's happening, Richard. It takes away the sting because when you see this book, the breathtaking photography, it tells the story of the Green Belt. And one of the things I loved about receiving my copy and flipping through it is that it in fact had a little narrative by both previous premiers, Mike Harris, as well as Dalton McGuinty. And that is really the power of the narrative of the Greenbelt, that it's just simply good policy that transcends politics and transcends political parties. And we all need to continue to be involved, of course, in telling this story, as well as telling the story of our ravines, telling the story of biodiversity and how critical it is to the thriving of human life and all life within our cities. So I have a copy of this book for each one of you to thank you for your contributions today. Thank you to everyone in our audience who kept us on our toes on Twitter, who also gave us comments to assist with the conversation, and thank you to the work that you do in creating a great city. That's a wrap, everyone.